welcome back to Teen Story Share. This week we're continuing The Bones of Birka, Unraveling the Mystery of a Female Viking Warrior by C.M. Surrisi. This time we're reading Chapter 3. If you missed Chapters 1 and 2, they'll be linked down below. Chapter 3. Hjalmar Stolpe, the King of Birka, and his most fascinating find. Hjalmar Stolpe had a reputation for being meticulous, determined, and passionate, long before he was standing at the precipice of grave BJ 581 in 1878. Imagine a young Stolpe foraging in the undergrowth of his family backyard. Dirt grinds into his knees and sweat drips from his forehead. He drags himself stealthily on his belly by his elbows to capture the elusive Swedish insect, the Neuropterida. Once he focuses on his prey, he strikes with lightning speed. Then, with muddy shoes, he bolts from the yard to the house and up to his room to record and categorize his new specimen. He ignores a call to dinner as he pens a letter to a scientific implement manufacturer, inquiring after special needles, forceps, and microscopes. Like almost every other kid, Stolpe liked some school subjects better than others, but his father, Justice Mayor Carl Johan Stolpe, was a stern man with high expectations of his son. Luckily, Hjalmar's scores in the natural sciences were not merely high, but the highest possible. His grades in math, Latin, and philosophy paled by comparison. His father wasn't entirely pleased, but he still doted on his clever and determined son. Stolpe's enthusiasm for insects didn't wane as he grew up, it only increased. He attended Uppsala University, where he studied ants and became an entomologist. His papers included skillful drawings. He painstakingly took hours to draw his ant subjects. Every detail of their eyes, sharp claws, antennae, and mandibles were all inked into his work. In his graduate paper, he passionately argued the importance of investigating ancient insects encased in fossilized tree resin called amber. As a passionate entomologist holding degrees in zoology and botany, he researched where amber was located so that he might find some and examine it for ancient insects. He learned that some amber had been found in a rich black dirt area of an island not far from Stockholm. The island was Björkö, and it was only a boat ride away. On Tuesday, October 3, 1871, Hjalmar Stolpe, now age 30, stepped onto a boat and took the 2-hour ride west of Stockholm to Lake Mälaren, which is a large bay of the Baltic Sea. The lake is made up of numerous arms that encircle many islands and jutting peninsulas. Stolpe was headed for one of those islands, Björkö. Björkö is only a few square miles in size, and the only inhabitants were a small number of farmers whose families had worked the land for generations. Stolpe likely paced the deck as the boat approached the island and itched to get his hands into its black dirt to find amber. And here's a picture of Hjalmar Stolpe, and the map you probably cannot see on this screen. So you'll have to look it up online or check out this book. Stolpe had packed equipment he used as a student, including the standard geological hammer, spade, and stick drill. He brought along very little clothing, not expecting to be there for a long time, but he did have notebooks to record his finds. Almost immediately after the boat docked, Stolpe jumped off and began to explore the island. The next day he strolled along the beach, making the first entries into his diary. He wrote of finding cones, wood, charcoal, bits of tree, hazelnuts, and cherry kernels. He happily noted, a small piece of amber. Soon he found this process too slow and turned from foraging and scraping the earth to drilling boreholes. He made lists in his notebooks documenting the exact places he had dug, including the farmer's potato fields, and he made his first sketches. Little did he know these notebooks and sketches would change archaeology forever. Stolpe may have been the first bug scientist on the island, but he wasn't the first scientist to poke around there. In the early 1800s, Johan Hadorf, the Swedish director of the Central Board of National Antiquities, dug in the soil. 2 or 3 graves had been excavated by F.W. Bronius in 1811, and 13 graves had been investigated by Alexander Seton in 1825 to 1827. One physician, Anders Blad, reported finding a multitude of strangely cut beads from amber, oriental carnelian, and other noble stones. But none of the others saw what Stolpe saw. Because ancient graves had been previously identified on the island, there was an ordinance for the protection of the remnants of prehistoric living areas. It required a permit to dig in locations that might contain ancient remains. But Stolpe ignored this. He was exploring the black earth area that had no visible signs of human remains or relics, so he powered ahead with his hole boring without seeking a permit. He wasn't exactly free to do what he wanted, though. Some scientists back in Stockholm, members of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, backed Stolpe, but many experts at the rival organization, the Royal Swedish Academy of Letters, History, and Antiquities, did not. They considered him a rank amateur, a non-archaeologist, and they kept their eyes on him. Bjorka may have been an island with a lot of black dirt, but all that black dirt, it turned out, was the site of Birka, an important Viking Age trading town mentioned in several medieval literary and historical sources. And Stolpe's boreholes were making Birka a political hot potato. Even though he was being observed by the watchdogs of the country's monuments, Stolpe continued digging, and he found many more interesting things than amber. Soon he requested, and was eventually given, official permission to dig within a specified area. With further digging, Stolpe ultimately concluded that the amber that he was finding, through dredging the harbor, had been dropped from Viking ships into the sea when they were unloading a cargo of amber from East Prussia, and not amber that was original to Birka's black dirt. As for the amber bits found in the soil, he believed they were also remnants of trade connections between Birka and the people around the Baltic. So, Birka ceased being about amber for Stolpe, and he pressed on to uncover the Viking town. Not only did he grab onto the expanded project with zeal, he also enlisted the help of local farmers, training them to be archaeological excavators. He called them his professors. One fine day he was rewarded with the discovery of an Iron Age refuse heap. He jubilantly wrote to his father about it. "I dug for 2 days in black earth, and dug 6 feet deep down to the varved clay, and then 8.5 feet with a drill. The remarkable finding during these digs was a layer of bones 5 feet thick, full of bones, ox, swine, sheep, pike, hare, fowl or water birds, worked horn of elk, etc. Iron fragments were found at a depth of 4 or 5 feet. My interpretation is that I was digging in a refuse heap from the Iron Age." He also wrote to his father that he wanted to bring some of his finds back to Stockholm to show the Academy of Sciences, but he needed a few things before the trip. He explained he'd been prudently doing all his digging in his nightshirt so that he would still have a clean day shirt. "I must ask for a wool sweater, a pair of underpants, a nightshirt, and a pair of wool socks immediately. Keep in mind I have been digging in black earth. Since I have been wearing my nightshirt during the day, this whole time on Bjorka, I already have a clean day shirt." It is hard to imagine that Stolpe had been doing all his excavating with only 2 shirts, one meant for the day and one he typically wore at night, and that he had even saved the day shirt for a trip back to Stockholm. He was happily enduring considerable discomfort and a lot of hand-washing for his Birka passion. Stolpe proudly made the presentation in Stockholm in front of many important people, and felt he had made a good impression. But he got into all kinds of hot water over his use of one word. During his presentation, Stolpe had described the garbage dump as a kitchen midden, and that, his enemies accused, was a gigantic mistake. They said any professional archaeologist should know kitchen midden was a Stone Age term, not an Iron Age term. They said his use of the term could mislead people about the date of the Birka find. One of his loudest critics, Hans Hildebrand, wrote, Only someone so inexperienced would use that term. The attack stung Stolpe. It also infuriated him. One word. His pride in his precision had been wounded. He fumed about it and wouldn't let it go. However, his personal notes and correspondence suggested he recognized the problem with the term. He had used kitchen midden, kjøkkenmudding, when he meant garbage dump, avskradeshug. And now there was a push among scientists not to accept him as an archaeologist. But Hjalmar Stolpe rose above it and showed what he was made of. He accepted that he needed to be a credentialed archaeologist to have academic standing at Birka, but he also felt archaeology needed to up its game by incorporating more science. He formulated a plan to make both of these things happen. Stolpe promotes a new archaeology and becomes a real archaeologist. Stolpe turned his efforts to promoting the advancement of what he called the new archaeology. He wrote, "I am convinced the only archaeology that has a future is that which supports itself in natural science." He also began academic work on his doctorate degree in archaeology with the same thesis in mind. Members of the Academy of Sciences loved Stolpe and his image for advancement of a new archaeology. He branded himself as a man of the future, one with natural science experience and a documented interest in archaeology, who was headed in the right direction. They supported him in his plan to fully take over responsibility for Birka. Stolpe put his efforts into writing a PhD dissertation and then acquiring the necessary approvals. With the help of his supporters, he was able to get the glowing reviews and approvals needed, not only from scientists, but also from leading classical archaeologists. Once he had the credential of archaeologist, it was decided Stolpe would be the one and only leader of the Birka investigation. Stolpe was earning his nickname of the King of Birka. He continued his excavations with zeal, and perhaps his background in entomology and geology was the best thing that could have happened to this site. As an entomologist, he was precise in his categorization, and as a geologist, he used his knowledge of scrutinizing earth and rock layer by layer, called stratigraphy, which produced careful examination. In his journal for 1872, Stolpe provides a list of the equipment he needed out on the island: bone brushes and old toothbrushes, glue, slippers, cummerbund, shaving kit, box of paints, medical supplies, a copy of the Gersbjorke map from 1826, measuring tape, a brass handle for a pair of water goggles, a sandwich box, cigar box, fly paper, shells, percussion caps, and the alcoholic beverages brandevin, ruinas, and sherry. Thereafter come notes about a dinner, with Swedish explorer Baron Nordenhold among the guests, who are served pork, Swedish punch, erik, and beer. Stolpe pioneered a digging technique that was an archaeological innovation for the Swedes. Stratigraphy had not been used in archaeology. Instead of a more or less random dig where things looked promising, the way Stolpe had dug the first year, he made strictly measured areas where the workers methodically dug themselves down. The result was a long, narrow dikes or pits, so-called trenches, which length could vary between 50 and 100 meters, between 1 and 3 meters wide, and about 2 meters deep. Much importance was placed on the pit wall profiles, depth and steepness, being cleanly polished. The piles of earth that were thrown up between the dikes had certainly been investigated, but this did not fulfill the demand. I have been compelled an uncountable number of times during the digs in the black earth to have the workers go again through the whole pile of turned over earth to find a fragment of an object that had been damaged while digging it up. Such a punishment dig, as it was surely considered by the workers, was just as important to keep the object as intact as possible as for the sake of the discipline. I could not let the workers believe that we let the excavations proceed unmethodically. In a report to the Academy of Sciences on January 8, 1873, he describes how the earth was carefully scanned, shovel for shovel, and how he applied a systematic and detailed examination and recording method to even the smallest item, so that small finds like Beads as well as fish bones could be collected, drawn, and placed into paper envelopes. The method was revolutionary in archaeology. It received international attention with the Anthropological Archaeological World Congress. Stolpe made scaled drawings on graph paper with squares of 1/10 of a decimaltum, approximately 0.97 inch or about 25 millimeters. He also appreciated the need to excavate an entire burial mound, not merely the center of it. In 1875, he wrote a letter to Hans Hildebrand. "I investigate the whole mound, leaving nothing unexcavated, and therefore often find several burials in one mound." Over time, his number of notebooks grew and eventually became an encyclopedia of the dig. They contained detailed drawings of graves, his comments, findings, measurements, archaeological data, and other valuable information. His team grew. He employed not only more local men, but also a young woman who worked at the site as an illustrator, and he even gave his daughter a role. With the help of his team, he uncovered cemeteries that encircled a town where 700 to 1,000 Viking people once lived over a period of 200 years. He numbered graves, recorded their condition with drawings and field notes, and carefully managed the contents, called grave goods. Not surprisingly, Stolpe treated source material with exacting standards. He recorded the names of each workman responsible for excavating each grave. Eriksson, or Erik, Stolpe's lead excavator, or head man, also recorded particulars in 13 notebooks. Here's a picture from one of Stolpe's notebooks. And if you want to try and see that map, it may not be too visible on camera, showing the location of the famous grave. BJ 581, the most fascinating grave in Birka. Then came the day in 1878 when Erik dug beneath one of the large granite boulders at a high point on the site, and history was made. After the workmen went through a painstaking process of removing a giant boulder from atop the grave and excavating the chamber, grave number BJ 581 revealed the body of what Stolpe interpreted as a high-ranking male Viking warrior and his impressive weapons and other grave goods. He took meticulous notes, made detailed drawings, and collected and stored the bones by grave number. Stolpe's interpretation was that the person was a high-ranking warrior from the 900s CE. Over time, Stolpe assessed the context and contents of the grave and came to remarkable conclusions. Grave BJ 581 was sited on a high point overlooking the water, harbor, and town, and could be seen from the town and the water. Its large memorial stone, if that's what it was, would have caught the eye from a distance. It was even higher in elevation than the two graves near it, that also contained numerous weapons. This position was between the more elevated hill fort and the lower situated garrison. The grave was built of logs and measured 11.5 feet by 5.5 feet and 5.9 feet deep. This would be approximately the size of a commercial dumpster. Also, Stolpe had learned from the experience of opening other graves that the boulders suggested high social rank or military service. The person was likely a defender of Birka. In addition to Stolpe's original drawing, there are 3 other drawings of the grave and its contents. The person in the grave. The grave contained a single body with most of the bones intact. The person appeared to have been seated initially, but had fallen to the side as the body deteriorated. It was Stolpe's opinion, which he noted in the journal for BJ 581, that bodies in chamber graves were usually seated. In the center of the chamber, the dead warrior seems to have been seated on a low chair. It is difficult to explain this strange position of the skeleton in any other way, and other finds demonstrate that the dead were usually seated in such chambers. The weapons were splendid. There was a full complement of weapons in BJ 581. The type, diversity, and volume of weapons suggested to Stolpe they belonged to a working military person of high rank and distinction. A sword, axe, fighting knife, 2 lances, 2 shields, and 25 armor-piercing arrows. In addition to the weapons, the skeleton in the grave held a bag with the pieces needed for playing a game of strategy. Stolpe described the bag as holding 3 weights, 3 dice, 27 game pieces, including a king piece, and a collection of angled pieces of iron that may have formed the game board. The game, known to archaeologists as Hnefatafl, was a Viking game similar to chess. Anyone could play the game, but those of higher or privileged status might have had higher quality pieces, and being a good player was itself a mark of refinement. Some experts have linked the game to military strategy and say it indicates the person had a knowledge of military tactics. Along with the weapons and horses, the game suggested the find of a significant military man. There have been similar finds in other burials of elites. Here's the weapons and the Hnefatafl board. And that was obviously just an artist's drawing of the Hnefatafl board, but these are the actual pieces found in the grave. According to archaeologist Leszek Gardella, furthermore, it is clear from Old Norse literature that playing strategy games, such as Hnefatafl, was not only a strictly male activity. Several women stemming from different social strata are portrayed in extant sources as actively engaging in this pastime. There are some textual hints, however, implying that the ability to play games was among the skills nobles were required to master. To illustrate the point, Gardella points to this 12th century poem by Earl Rognvaldr of Orkney. I am quick at playing chess. I have 9 skills. I hardly forget runes. I am often at either a book or craftsmanship. I am able to glide on skis. I shoot and row, so it makes a difference. I understand both the playing of the harp and poetry. The horses. Finding a horse skeleton in a Viking grave was not unusual, but finding 2 horse skeletons was extraordinary, as they were reserved for higher-ranking warriors. And finding the skeletons of a stallion and a mare was even more unusual. Their presence signaled the importance of this person, as warriors needed their horses in their graves so they could travel with them to Valhall, the Hall of the Slain in Norse mythology. Near the horse skeletons were 4 ice crampons, or snowshoes for horse hooves. There was also a comb made of antler that was so large that Stolpe believed it had to be a currycomb for the horses. The clothing. Remnants of the person's clothing survived. They were from imported silk textiles embroidered with silver brocade. The cloth looked to be from the Eurasian steppe, an area of grassland extending from modern-day Hungary through Ukraine and Central Asia to Manchuria in northeastern China. This is an area that Vikings were known to travel to on raids and for trade. It wasn't clear to Stolpe whether these items were manufactured in Birka or acquired on travels abroad, but he was convinced that they were the property of a high-ranking warrior, since only such an individual would have such objects in connection with the weapons and horses in the grave. The hat, pin, and buckles. Along with the clothing, Stolpe and his team found 40 tiny fragments of mirrored glass on the ground of the grave, as well as a simple ring-shaped pin of iron near the skeleton's shoulder. A silver-trimmed cap of luxurious silk with an unusual silver tassel was also found, as were 4 plum-shaped granulated silver balls. Some experts believe they hung from the tassel. Others say they may have been attached to other parts of the cap. A miniature spearhead with a hole pierced through it seemed to have been used as a pendant. What was not in the grave? Many books on Vikings describe their graves in terms of stories passed down through the ages, such as burial by burning in a boat if the person was high-ranking. But one of the hallmarks of Viking funeral ritual is that almost every grave was unique in its details. BJ 581 was no exception. It contained an array of items that Stolpa associated with the profession of warrior. That did not mean that a sword, a spear, or axe hasn't been found in other, non-warrior graves, but in this one there was an unusual assemblage. In addition, there were no grave goods that Stolpa would have associated with typical female cultural roles, such as jewelry, weaving tools, and keys. To him, the evidence weighed in favor of a warrior grave, which, without hesitation, and probably without conscious contemplation, meant, to him and researchers at the time, a male warrior. Okay, we're going to take a break to read this little piece about Viking burials. Cremations and inhumations. The Viking Age society had burial practices that included cremations of various kinds, as well as a number of different types of inhumation burials, in which the body is left whole and put in the ground. Some of these differences relate to regional traditions, while others are attributed to specific contexts, like the chamber graves. High-status burials were present in all forms of burial practice. Graves were often covered by earth mounds. The size of the earth mound that was constructed over the grave was also significant. Graves covered by great mounds and/or large stones signaled burials of chieftains or other high-ranking individuals, both men and women. These are most often cremations. They could include horses and other animals that were placed on the pyre, as well as extensive grave goods, much like in the chamber burials. Inhumation burial practice was less common, as were boat graves, which could be either inhumations or cremations, and always represent people of higher social status. Many people didn't get a grave at all. Their bodies were either disposed of in water or their ashes scattered without a formal burial. However, we don't know who these people were or whether their status was involved. Cremation in itself doesn't mean low status. Plenty of high-status folk were burned. If anything, the differences seem to be regional. And finally, it all added up. The full collection of weapons, the 2 horses, the strategy game, the foreign clothing and adornment, the positioning of the grave, the location of the grave, the positioning of the body, the type of grave, the sealing of the grave, these were all indicators of the burial of a significant individual. Stolpa knew it. He was well aware he had uncovered a remarkable example of an important Viking warrior. In fact, he pronounced BJ 581 to be perhaps the most remarkable grave of all the graves in this field. And because in Stolpa's time the belief was that all Viking warriors were men, his field notes described BJ 581 as the grave of a high-ranking male warrior. One of Stolpa's greatest accomplishments was his detailed documentation. He stated what he saw. It was all new to him. Archaeologists who came after Stolpa were able to use his documentation to answer questions that he could not have conceived. With the passage of time, the viewpoints on the Birka finds evolved and science advanced. One of the advancements was the science of osteology, the study of bones, which raised a question about the person's maleness. All right, next time is going to be our last chapter reading from this book, and just so we can get to a little bit more detail about the actual person buried in this grave, we're going to skip ahead 2 chapters, and next time we're going to read chapter 6, Osteologists Weigh In on the Birka Warrior. All right, have a great weekend. Bye.